Well, this has taken many takes to try and get this video made, but hopefully this will work. All right. It is almost 6:45, so it's not going to be up before 7 o'clock. And so if you're watching this video, hooray for you and kudos for being diligent and hanging in there. Remember, you don't have to take video notes on this yet. You won't be quizzed until Monday, but I was hoping that you could kind of see this information so it's not completely foreign tomorrow. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? Macromolecules. Well, macromolecules are basically organic molecules. So when you were in physical science, you learned about the inorganic elements. These are the organic ones, things that are either from living things or they themselves are living things. Okay, so what are we talking about? Well, there's characteristics that make them organic compounds, these macromolecules. One of the things is that they have covalent bonds. Another is that they have very specific structures to them. They might be in a straight form, like this one here. They might be in a straight form with a branch, like as in this one, or they might be in a what we call the ring formation, even though I know it's not an actual ring shape, but it's got that circular-ish motion to it where they're all connected, and so they call it the ring formation. Okay. So those are kind of generic things about all four of the macromolecules in general. Okay. Another thing about them is that they are made up of base units that are hooked together to make these full units. And the base unit or the subunit is called the monomer, mono meaning one. And so one unit is the monomer, and each macromolecule has its own special type of monomer. Well, if you take these monomers and you hook them together in either the chain or the branched or the ringed or any of that formation, you get what we call polymers. Poly meaning many, hooked together, many chains. So those are features of all the macromolecules in general. The first macromolecule that we want to look at is the carbohydrate group. Okay, you probably generically know the carbohydrate group as starches and sugars. That's what they're known as commonly. It's things like your sugars, your soda pops, your fruit juices, your starches are like your pastas, your potatoes, your breads, those kind of things. So those are the foods that you eat that fall into those categories. They have the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen elements in the molecule, and they're bonded in a very specific ratio of a 1-to-1 ratio. So one carbon, 2 hydrogens, and 1 oxygen. The base unit is known as the monomer is known as glucose. Okay, so it is the simplest form of a carbohydrate, and you can see it over here in its ring shape. This is what the glucose molecule specifically looks like. Carbohydrates as a whole classification only have 4 calories per gram. So that's going to become important when we look at food labels and how to calculate total grams of fat or total grams of total calories of grams or total calories of foods. That's what we're going to look at. That's one of the activities we're going to do. Another interesting piece about carbohydrates is that if you do not use the energy from the carbohydrates when you immediately digest it, it gets converted and stored as fat in your body. Okay, that's why carbohydrates aren't such a great thing to eat in abundance, because if your body doesn't metabolize it right away, it's going to store it as fat. All right, so here is the breakdown of what carbohydrates are. Okay, you've got basically your sugars and your starches, as I said. Sugars fall into 2 categories, the monosaccharides and the disaccharides. So as a polymer, you can have a monosaccharide or a disaccharide. And what that means is it's, how many sugars there are. Well, mono, again, means one. So this is glucose. This is the monomer. This is a single individual glucose molecule, monosaccharide. Also, you might have heard the word high fructose corn syrup mentioned in food labels. Well, fructose is also in that same simple sugars category. They give us our quick energy, right? You eat something sugary and instantly you feel that I've got energy, I'm going to go. You have a soda drink with lots of sugar in it, you feel like you're ready to go right away. Another type of sugar, and this is called disaccharides, a little bit more in the chain. So more in the polymer category, and this is sucrose and lactose. Sucrose you may have heard of. A lot of the sugar supplements that you see on the shelf may have sucrose in it. Lactose you probably have heard of, because some people say that I'm lactose intolerant. Well, they can't digest this molecule. They don't have the enzyme to help with that. So we'll look at that in a little bit when we look at the enzyme category. So those are your sugars, monosaccharides and disaccharides. And mono is the, or glucose is the monomer, so it's the simple, monosaccharide is the simple version, disaccharide is a little bit more complex. Okay. Now to get even more complex are the polysaccharides, and this is what makes up the sugar group. Polysaccharides meaning more monomers in the chain. And they're things like cellulose and glycogen. Cellulose we find in plants, and we're going to see that when we look at the cell membrane of plants, or I'm sorry, the cell wall of plants. You'll see that cellulose is what gives plants the ability to be able to grow tall without a skeletal system in them. It's also part of the exoskeleton of bugs. It's that hard exterior coating that, if you squish a bug and you hear that, that's the exoskeleton crunching, and it's because it's got that rigidity to it from cellulose. Glycogen we would find in our bodies, in our muscular system. All right, so those are the carbohydrates, and breaking them down into sugars and starches, your monomer, which is your monosaccharide, your polymers, which are your disaccharide, and your polysaccharide. Okay, next category is the lipids, commonly known as the fats. There are examples that fall into this category: your butters, your oils, your lard. Most people don't realize that cholesterol and testosterone also fall in this category, and they are what we call steroid hormones, but they are also lipids. The monomer of a lipid is the fatty acid, and if you bond a fatty acid with a molecule called glycerol, you get the polymer. And it's going to look something like this. This is actually a triglyceride. You might have heard an older family member say, my triglycerides are high. That's one of the things they monitor when you get older. And if you have high triglycerides, you might have to go on medication to help get those numbers down. But that's what it looks like. It's 3 fatty acids bonded together with the glycerol. 9 calories per gram. So you can actually see that there's more caloric value in fats, and that probably makes sense given that, they, generally speaking, nutritionists tell you to kind of eat those in moderation because they are so high in calories. Well, now you see that there's definitely a difference in calories. Functions of lipids. Well, okay. First off, it's long-term storage. We store energy in fats, right, in fat cells, right, so that we have that for using. And if you exercise and you eat a smaller diet, then you burn those calories out of the fat cells. Okay, so that's pretty standard information. Another function of lipids is that they are important in cushion and insulation and lubrication. Well, cushion, obviously, you put a little fat on your body and it gives you, helps you from impact. Insulation, same thing, a little extra fat on your body helps you stay warmer. It's why we tend to put on a couple extra pounds in the winter months when it's colder outside. Our body is naturally just saying, pack on a few pounds to make, to help yourself feel warmer. But you also need this cushion and insulation in your abdomen to protect your vital organs, your heart, your lungs, your liver, your kidneys, all those vital organs. So the abdomen tends to be a place where we don't really always think of the fat, but we definitely need it for that. Lubrication, it comes in the category of the waxes, like earwax. It's just a lubrication that your body produces to make sure that things operate accordingly. From the hormone category, remember we're talking about testosterone and cholesterol. They are important in growth and development. And then, of course, we talked about the lipids important in the cell membrane of a cell, and it's specifically important in, or the one that we're going to learn about is called a phospholipid, and it makes up the phospholipid bilayer of the cell. And we'll look at this in a lot more detail later on when we do our cell unit, but this ball and then kind of like tail is what that phospholipid is, and you can see they kind of interlace together to make the membrane what we call semi-permeable. So some things get through and other things don't, which we'll look at in more detail later. To kind of give a bigger view of what the phospholipid is, in the cell membrane, it has a head region and a tail region. The head region is polar, and the tail is nonpolar. The head's made up of phosphate and oxygen, and the tail is made up that carbon hydrogen chain that we looked at that's common in all the molecules. So like I said, we'll look at that in more detail later on in the cell unit. Fats also get categorized in, you've probably heard this when you think about food labels, something that's saturated, unsaturated, polysaturated, or trans fats. Well, what that's referring to is how the carbon hydrogen or how the carbon to carbon bonds are made. So saturated fats have a single bond between the carbon and carbon. Unsaturated fats have a double bond that appears between some of the carbons. And then polysaturated would be triple bonds, and trans fats are man-made fats that are really not good for you at all. Health nutrition wise. So you do not have to know that. I just wanted to make sure you're aware of that, because eventually you're going to be somebody who pays attention to the labels that you eat and understanding the chemistry behind it. The bond, a single bond is easier to break than a double bond, which is easier to break than a triple bond, which explains why some of these are easier to digest, like a single bond, than something that's more complex to digest, which is like the double bond. All right, next category is the proteins. And in the proteins, you probably know them. They're your meats, your beans, the cheeses, dairy products, those kind of things. Those give you your proteins. We're going to look at the base unit, which is the amino acid. There are 20 amino acids that we'll look at a lot more detail when we look at our DNA RNA unit later on. Caloric value is 4 calories per gram, so it's the same as a carbohydrate. Now, this is kind of the configuration, and I want to get into some more detail on that later. There are basically 5 categories of proteins, and they're classified based on the function that they perform, which makes it easier to understand. But there's the transport proteins, which of course transport things. And what does they transport? Well, hemoglobin is one of them, and you've probably heard that before when you looked at maybe the hemoglobin levels in your blood. It's the molecule that picks up the oxygen at your lungs and then transports it throughout your body so that your body has oxygen to be able to do respiration in like the muscle cells. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail later too. Structural proteins, obviously, they provide structure. So things like the keratin in your body is a protein, and it's in your hair, which gives it strength. So you can actually, it takes quite a bit of effort actually to break a strand of hair. If you grab it and pull it, and you'll see that's the keratin protein that's in there that gives it that strength. In your fingernails and in your toenails, also, it's keratin that gives them strength. Enzymatic proteins, obviously, are enzymes. They, as you learned back in physical science, basically increase the rate of a chemical reaction. The ones we're going to look at this year or this semester, helicase, we'll definitely look at when we look at DNA replication, and DNA polymerase and RNA polymerase also fall in that same category. Lactase, here's that enzyme that works on digesting lactose. And what you'll see in common is ASE, just to kind of draw your attention to something. Most enzymes will always end in ASE, and that's one of the identifiers that it's an enzyme. It's a good little trick to know. There can be hormone proteins, and in this case we're talking about things like insulin that your pancreas would be producing that helps regulate your blood sugar, or antibodies that help fight in your immune system. Those proteins, they basically help with the regulation of your body. Contractile proteins, these are like your muscle fibers. So actin and myosin are in your muscles, and they're responsible for movement. So they work with contracting the muscles. Okay, back to that structure piece of it. There is a unique feature to the protein, and it's called the R group. You don't necessarily need to know what elements are making up this R group, only that the R group exists, and it's nitrogen-based. The bond that exists between these monomers, these amino acids that bond together, is a peptide bond. Okay, that's an important piece to know. Okay, and the last piece is just a structure. What you need to walk away with from this slide is knowing that proteins are put together. You take those 20 amino acids and you can put them in together in a wide array of molecules, and each one of those molecules would then have a different function. So that's what this slide is really trying to get to you. The way the amino acids are arranged basically tells you the shape, which also then tells you its function. All right, last group is the nucleic acids. This is your DNA and your RNA that we're going to look at. The base or the monomer is the nucleotide, and if I'll flip to this next slide here, you can see the nucleotide is a phosphate group, a sugar group. In this case, it's deoxyribose because we're looking at a DNA molecule nucleotide, and then you have your nitrogen base here. So those are the components. So you can see we have the sugar, phosphate, and a nitrogen that we picked up. And like I said, it's DNA and RNA, which DNA is our genetic information. It stores the code that makes you who you are. RNA then is the molecule that reads that code and makes all the proteins that make up your body. And that's a process called protein synthesis that we will look at later on in that same unit. So that is what you need to know on the macromolecules. And like I said, we're going to fill in this table that'll have all this information tomorrow, and we'll start looking at the how do you test to identify these macromolecules. All right, so that is where we are at. Have a good evening. If you get to see this, great. And I will see you in class tomorrow. Remember, the quiz is not till Monday, so you can just watch this video now and then take notes over it on the weekend if you want. Okay?